Supplementary question.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I take offence to the last comment made by the Minister, and I ask her to withdraw and apologise.
Order. I was about to do that, but then there was so much interjection came from my left on the basis that it has now been raised by the member. I require the Minister to stand and withdraw the last part of that answer.
I withdraw the last remarks.
Order. Question number 8. Order. Question number 8, David Clendon.
Mr Speaker. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. Order. Point of order, Grant Robertson. And this will be a point of order that I expect to be heard in silence.
Mr Speaker, you required the Minister to withdraw that statement. She subsequently interjected across the House that she wasn't going to apologise for it because it was true, which I believe runs counter to your ruling.
If the Minister did interject, I would be most upset. I'm asking the Minister, did she interject in that vein?
Mr Speaker, I was reacting to a comment that
Order.
came from
If the member then did, if the Minister...
No, I'm sorry. It was to another comment that told me I was supposed to apologise. And I said, no, it's true.
Look, for the benefit of all members, when an offence is taken by any remark, I consider the tone of the question, the words and words were used, I am the sole determinant of the action that is then taken. It might in some cases require a member to withdraw the comment. It may in some cases require a member to withdraw and apologise for the comment. And in the very extreme, it may require the Minister or member to leave the House if I so decide. But I'm the determinant of that, and I determine it on the basis of each incident. It is difficult for any member to compare one with another. I will make the decision. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I absolutely understand that, and I don't think that that's the issue in question. The issue in question is where a minister is required to withdraw and apologise, or any member, and then basically uses an interjection to say, but I don't mean it. You know, like in this case, the minister withdrew her comment and then interjected, and whether it was in response to you or someone else, and saying, I didn't mean any of that. Order. That actually makes the whole process meaningless.
Order. The difficulty is I didn't hear the interjection. Order. I then took it up with the Minister, who said at that stage she was responding to a further interjection to somebody else. It is difficult to go back. If the Minister had taken the opportunity of then saying she didn't agree with the withdrawal of this comment, I'd do something about it. I cannot be sure that that was the case. Question number 8, David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And to the Minister of Corrections, is she confident the Department of Corrections will be meeting all of its targets by 2017?
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Speaker, it's going to be tough, but if anyone can, the Department of Corrections can.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, David Clendon.
When did the Corrections Department first inform the Minister that the muster is due to hit close to 10,000 by the close of this year, a blowout of some 1,200 inmates?
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Probably in our first meeting, actually, Mr Speaker, but I'd say that I wouldn't call it a blowout. I'd say that the right people are in prison for the right time.
Point of order, Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Sir, I appreciate the Minister addressing the question.
Order. Order. This is a point of order. There'll be no interjections from anybody. Ministers, front benches from either side, if they're going to continue to interject on points of order, they leave me no choice to be asking people to leave the chamber. David Clendon, point of order.
Mr Speaker, the Minister did address the question, but I'm not party to knowing when her first meeting with the head of the department was.
Order. I gather the point. If the Minister could assist us by telling us approximately when the first meeting took place with your officials.
Well, Mr Speaker, I was sworn in as the Minister of Corrections on the 18th of December 2015, so it would be sometime after that. But if the member really wants to know, he could pop it down as a primary question.
Supplementary question, David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What is the extra cost to the taxpayer of the unforeseen increase in the prison population?
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Well, Mr Speaker, that depends very much on what Corrections has to do in relation to that, but I would say to that member that the cost to the taxpayer is nothing compared to the cost to victims of being victimised by violent offenders.
Supplementary question, David Clendon.
Is the Minister aware that inmates are being denied parole because of the backlog of inmates awaiting rehabilitation programs that they must complete before they can be granted parole.
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Mr Speaker, I think the parole board always tries to get people to undertake their programs, but I'd also say to that member that sometimes it's not. Oh dear. Well, ask a question, Mr Little, if you really want to.
Order.
Is that the Corrections Department can't force people to undertake programs and rehabilitation programs, and quite often they've said to me that they can't get some offenders to do that.
Supplementary question, David Clendon.
Will the Minister allocate more funding to rehabilitation and reintegration, given comments made to the Select Committee this morning by Ray Smith, the Chief Executive, that more spending on reintegration and rehabilitation will reduce the prison population?
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Mr Speaker, the member will have to wait for Budget 2016.
Supplementary question, David Clendon.
Does the Minister now regret some of the policies she's affected in her term as Justice Minister, given that those same policies have contributed to the blowout in the prison population?
The Honourable Judith Collins.
Oh, well, definitely not. And in fact, I'd say to that member that what has in fact led to an increase in the prison population is that very serious violent offenders are being treated as very serious violent offenders.
Question number 9.